Good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure to see you here during our Friday morning Science, Conservation and Humanities seminars. My name is Vanessa Sellers. I'm the director of the Humanities Institute, and we offer these seminars every morning together with the Science Department with Charles Zimmerman. Susan Fraser, the director of the library, and I'm really happy that you're here to hear again the second part of our Summer Fellows and Junior Mellon Fellows presentations. They have been working here for the last 7 to 8 weeks, each on their own topics, and they use the garden, the premises, the herbarium, and here the historical collection of the library for their research that has a historical educational compound and is always at the intersection of the plant sciences and the humanities. They will give this morning, just like last week, a progress report of their studies this summer, and in the coming years we expect them to work on that further. The first speaker today is Benjamin Weinger. Ben is a senior at the Gallatin School of Individualized Studies at the New York University, crafting an interdisciplinary concentration in critical geography and the environmental humanities. His research at NYBG this summer has been contextualizing contemporary narratives of the contested Anthropocene theme and Epoch in social ecological narratives of the past. Ben's research draws on the theoretical and analytical frameworks of political ecology. He's recovering neglected narratives in pursuit of counter-realities and alternative knowledge in his talk this morning, Landscapes of the Anthropocene, Reading New York City, Pasts, Presents, Futures. Please help me in welcoming Ben.
Does it go back? Sorry. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. So as Vanessa said, my name is Ben, and my work here at the Gardens and in general may be a slight departure from traditional forms of scholarship. So I take as my foundation post-structuralism's enduring legacy of critique and deconstruction to reflect all and contest all nodes of knowledge, to politicize the land, environment, and spatial conditions of society, as well as ultimately understand presents and futures through contested narratives of the past. Now, before I go any further, I would also like to begin by acknowledging the ancestral and unceded territories of the Lenape peoples that we are sitting on. This type of recognition is becoming much more customary in spaces like these, and to me is a really important foundation for thinking about how climate change and climate justice are really inseparable from Indigenous history, political thought, and rights movements. A spoken recognition in this way can also be an action that materializes relationships between peoples, lands, and waters. On another note, I would also like to thank the Garden's amazing librarians and archivists, Samantha, Rashad, Esther, Stephen, for their tireless help in navigating these collections, as well as Vanessa Sellers and Susan Fraser for the true privilege of being able to join the Humanities Institute this summer. So here at the Mertz Library, I was given the opportunity to conduct research contextualizing narratives of the Anthropocene, which for those unfamiliar with the term is the contested and proposed geological epoch, the epoch where human activities have become, quote, so pervasive and profound so as to rival the great forces of nature. And through this interdisciplinary science-humanities framework, I was able to study narratives of the Anthropocene within indigenous perspectives and histories dating to settler colonial encroachment and annexation of the Americas. My research ultimately focuses on interpreting European settlement and colonization of Lenapehoking, or the living and ancestral Lenape homeland covering this mid-Atlantic United States, in relationship to geographic conceptions of nature and land, property and citizenship, ecology and climate dynamics, pasts, presents, and futures. So this research was fundamentally inspired and informed by Matisse scholar Zoe Todd, who in 2016 disrupted the study of climate change by contesting this dominant Anthropocene narrative. She asks, what does it mean to have a reciprocal discourse on catastrophic end times and apocalyptic environmental change? in a place where, over the last 500 years, indigenous peoples faced and face the end of worlds with the violent incursion of colonial ideologies and actions? What does it mean to hold in simultaneous tension stories of the Anthropocene in the past, the present, and the future? So I will come back to these complex questions throughout this presentation. But before I dive into my research, I will also tell you, in a manner not customary to an academic bibliography, that I am an uninvited settler of Ashkenazi Jewish and Western European ancestry, and that I was born on lands of the Peoria and Potawatomi, or the part of Turtle Island or North America known as Skokie, Illinois, which you could see on the left. The very name and insignias of the place I was raised, this is the seal of Skokie, Illinois, as well as the place I currently inhabit here in New York City, they invoke these very native peoples and the lifeways who once lived here. Yet, of course, I never received a history lesson about these first peoples and the lands that I was effectively occupying. Now, this way of stating who I am and where I come from emphasizes my legal relationships, intimate geographies, and settler responsibilities. When I say that I am a settler, it also foregrounds our particular history. It acknowledges that I continue to inhabit a social and political structure that shapes the power to govern, map, and extract, a structure that is deeply unsettled and disquieted by continued indigenous political presence and resistance. In reflecting on positionality, I also challenge normative modes of scholarship in attempt of politicizing and illuminating the contradictions that have long structured my very being. Now, while housed here at the Garden, I drew my inspiration and research from many different sources. I've had the incredible opportunity to harness the expertise of many staff members here at the Gardens, and one of my favorite interactions was with the site historian and cartographer who spoke about the history's lands in relation to the Lenape peoples. This reconstructed wigwam here in the Edible Academy, for example, and also the Three Sisters companion plants on the left. These are just one way that the Garden aims to teach the Lenape history. I also relied heavily on materials here at the Mertz Library, from settler travel narratives and journals to more modern histories of the land, such as Eric Sanderson's Mannahatta, or the Walam Olum migration legend of the Lenape, which are over on display on the table. Now, before getting into some of the work I did, I also want to explain a bit about my process, which again invokes the critical interventions of post-structuralism, or in other words, the understanding that all knowledge is produced and contestable. As I house my studies in the discipline of geography, for example, I must recognize the discipline's historical production of knowledge and its central role in the imperial and colonial projects. Technologies and methodologies that produced delimited and controlled space, exploration, cartography, or even the construction of spatial division, for example, I now ironically employ or study to try and understand these inequalities, the divisions, and the spatial arrangements of present society. In the words of Donna Haraway, all knowledge is a condensed node in an agonistic power field. History is a story Western culture buffs tell each other. Science is a contestable text in a power field. The content is the form, period. So now that you've seen a bit about the process that shaped this research, I'll jump right into what I actually spent the majority of my time doing here, which is a comparative analysis of settler and indigenous accounts. Uncivil, wild men, peculiar barbarians, unlearned persons. So goes the dominant historical narratives that introduce us to the Lenape in the quote-unquote age of discovery. These often aggrandized, fallacious, and erroneous discourses tell of a just conquest, the ushering of modernity, and the symbolic rejection of the quote-unquote old world in embrace of the new world. But I will also add that the new world, similar to the false presumption of discovery, indiscriminately erases centuries of histories of native inhabitants. Just the very word new erases this history, assuming a kind of blank slate. Navigating these narratives carefully and critically through a process of historical revisionism, my research contests mainstream and orthodox discourses of historical events written by settlers related to the Lenape, as well as the complicity of geography in the establishment of the Dutch, the Swedish, the English, and ultimately American settlements in this area. So on the screen here, you see the Netherland monuments in Battery Park at the southern tip of Manhattan, depicting the peaceful exchange of the island by the Lenape to the Dutch for 60 guilders, which is like a sum of money as the Dutch narrative goes. But revisionist historiography looks more complexly at this narrative. While a semblance of native volunteerism is often invoked, as Patrick Wolfe, the foremost scholar of settler colonial theory, writes, preemption sanctioned European priority, but not indigenous freedom of choice. So in other words, settler entitlement to buy or expropriate always supplanted native rights not to sell or to remain. Different perceptions of property ownership and land tenure were also likely not accounted for or perhaps even purposefully disregarded. So in the center here is a document from 1926, now in the Dutch National Archives in The Hague, depicting the sale of land in the words of the Dutch West India Company, and this is the translation on the left. And now on the right, we have 3 Lenape narratives that sort of contest the settler account. And of course, given the privileging of history and the general archive to written settler accounts, these perspectives on the right, these indigenous perspectives, were recorded much later in time, oftentimes in the 20th century. And while some may disavow these perspectives, for example, for their relative youth, again, given the historical structures of violence and dispossession, of language capabilities, of hegemonic authority over history and the archive, these indigenous perspectives, until just a few decades ago, were just simply not found in the archive. And for that reason, we can't just disavow them, but we have to treat them with the same sort of critical regard. So for lack of time, I'll focus on the Lenape narratives because the Dutch one is pretty simple, that the Dutch bought the land from the Lenape through a peaceful exchange. So the first Lenape narrative on the right from a tribal elder reads, "Our people did not understand the European concept of buying or selling land. Land to us was like air, sunlight, and water. Our thought was that we were giving the whites some land to live on for a while. There was also much deception in persuading our people to sacrifice our rights of occupancy." And the second narrative from the Wallam Olum of the Mertz Library's collections on the table reads, "Alas, alas, we know now who they are, these white men who came out of the sea to rob us of our land, starving wretches. With smiles they came, but soon became snakes or foes." And then the final one, which I won't read for lack of time right now, is the official statement of today's Delaware tribe, or the Lenape peoples, and it parallels these arguments by speaking about different conceptions of land. Now, drawing on traditions of political ecology and critical geography, which are post-structuralism, post-colonialism, indigenous and subaltern, queer, feminist, and also science and technology studies, I approach this research recognizing, in the words of critical historian Saadia Hartman, that the archive is inseparable from the play of power. While historians are often restricted to facts, which in this case often means settler narratives, like the letter that was found in The Hague that I just showed earlier, often found in libraries and archives, the deeply prejudiced origins and contestabilities of what Hartman calls these manufactured certainties, not facts, requires that we instead critically examine the ideological biases that sort of construct these narratives. This can be approached through a vigorous lens of deconstruction in the tradition of Jacques Derrida. So in other words, we could look at the settler account in that letter and believe it as a fact. We could just believe that the Dutch peacefully and legally acquired this land of Mannahatta. But perhaps certain kinds of histories by certain types of peoples in certain types of language, even in certain types of conditions in written versus oral, have been privileged for centuries in the archive, and oftentimes these are not told from the lens of the colonized. So the Mertz Library and additional institutions around New York City utilized in this research are, of course, renowned institutions with incredible sources of knowledge dedicated to educating the public on nature and the environment. But I also must recognize in this tradition the constraints of my research, whose parameters are ultimately and undoubtedly inscribed within these archives, operative within the narratives subject to critique, extrapolated from the world of the colonizers, from archives constructed largely by settlers, from institutions that regulate by will or ignorance knowledge of the past. So the scarcity of Lenape narratives in most New York institutions requires that I respectfully transcend the boundaries of what cannot be known or what has been treated as not worthy of history, while also attempting to liberate the Lenape, in the words of Hartman, quote, from sort of these obscene descriptions that first introduced them to us, which was what I read earlier, sort of uncivil, savage, etc. So the story of the Lenape, again in Hartman's tradition, is predicated upon impossibility, listening for the unsaid, translating misconstrued words, refashioning disfigured lives. So jumping right into another comparative analysis, on the left we have a Lenape narrative written by that same tribal elder, speaking of his people's first encounters with Dutch settlers. And on the right, we have a settler narrative from Robert Jouett, an officer on Henry Hudson's ship, the most complete original account of Hudson's journey, written in 1609, and of course it's a translation. So I start with the Lenape perspective on the left. One day, some Lenape men were out fishing at a place where the sea widens on what is now called Long Island. In the far distance, they saw a strange shape floating on the water, unlike anything they had ever seen before. At last, the whites proposed to stay here with us and asked for enough land for a garden spot. The chiefs readily granted this apparently reasonable request, but then the whites took a knife and, beginning at one end of the hide, cut it up into a long rope not thicker than a child's finger. It was drawn out into a circle, and it encompassed a large piece of ground. We lived together peacefully for a long time, though from time to time the whites would ask for more land, which was given to them. But they gradually proceeded further and further up the Hudson River until it began to dawn on we Lenape that they would soon want all of our country. And so it proved to be. And now the settler perspective from Henry Hudson's first encounter with Native Americans reads, "Then we manned our boat and scoot with 12 men and muskets and 2 stone pieces or murderers, and drave the savages from their houses, and took the spoil of them as they would have done us. At night they went on land again, so we rode very quiet, but we did not trust them. So they went in 2 leagues and saw an open sea and returned. And as they came back, they were set upon by 2 canoes, the one having 12, the other 14 men. The night came on, and it began to rain, so that their march went out. In the morning, 2 great canoes came aboard full of men, the one with their bows and arrows, and the other in shew of buying of knives to betray us. But we perceived their intent. We took 2 of them to have kept them and put red coats on them, and would not suffer the other to come near us." So these are just, again, 2 examples of different narratives of colonization, yet the narratives we often learn, or perhaps not even learn, is something like the one on the right, from the lens of the colonizer in this quote-unquote age of discovery. So now, as a geographer in training, I also wanted to return to the idea of delimiting and defining space, or the production of settler space and time. So on the tables over here, you'll see many different maps created by settlers from this collection here in the gardens, dating back as early as the 17th century, and these are all copies of the maps. So through a critical lens, Bruno Latour, as well as many other critical geographers, cite the production of geographic knowledge of spatial division and the tools of cartography, though, as primary instruments in the production of settler space and spatial domination. Discussing the tools of visualization and domination, Latour writes, "The very notion of scale is impossible to understand without an inscription or a map in mind. The great man is a little man looking at a good map." So Carolyn Merchant similarly discusses the establishment of confining boundaries, often through fencing in colonized spaces, and sort of the demarcation of wild and civil made through these fences, which set up conditions for power relations, for spatial control, and for exploitation. As the Lenape were traditionally mobile communities and itinerants of nature, sort of seasonal change and ecological phenomena, the imposition of European space and time through maps or through the Gregorian calendar, for example, radically altered traditional lifestyles and interactions with the environment. Pierre Bourdieu, a famous sociologist, in his theory of practice, offers a possible effect of imposing these temporal regimes, describing the submission or the interpolation, as Althusser might say, of social actors to collective rhythms that define their temporal and spatial order and divisions. This social structuring of temporality creates hierarchies and boundaries. The Lenape are seen as anterior and archaic, primeval and primitive, sort of the temporal other, through a civilizational discourse. Or in other words, through this dominant European discourse, the Netherlands or the Dutch, they're viewed as sort of the civilized futurity, while the pre-European contact Native Americans, here the Lenape-Hoking or the Lenape peoples, are always viewed as sort of this uncivil past. Colonialism, then, is viewed and justified by settlers as a benevolent educating force, a force of progress to what they may consider an antiquated indigenous mind. For settlers, this temporal frontier positioned the Lenape-Hoking and the Lenape peoples as an anachronism. Their very ways of being and knowing inherently transgress the prescribed social, political, religious, as well as temporal and spatial orders of quote-unquote civilized European society. Settlers imposed an ideological evolutionary grid, the resemblance of which you can sort of see on these maps, sort of positioning the white subject always as advanced. These cultural fantasies, though, again are used as justification for settler colonialism and must be critically examined in comparative perspective to indigenous ontologies or alternative ways of being and knowing. In returning to Zoe Todd's questions on reciprocal discourses of the Anthropocene, I now turn to present discussions of this proposed epoch, this proposed geological epoch. So many scholars, of course, identify the geological epoch that humans became the primary drivers of planetary systems as the Anthropocene, a term many are probably familiar with. And while some may be familiar with the contestations surrounding a date for this epoch, did it begin with the annexation of the Americas? Did it begin with the Industrial Revolution? Did it begin with the great acceleration of accumulations like nuclear energy in the 1950s? Another issue, and perhaps more important, was first brought to attention by indigenous scholars, is sort of the Anthropocene's universalizing tendency in sort of subsuming all humans and lifeways. In other words, the very verbiage of the anthropos, or humanity, suggests that we are all responsible, but of course the science and data tells sort of a more complicated story. Personally, when adopting the term Anthropocene, I always like to add a caveat. I like to acknowledge that not all of humanity is responsible for these changes. All humans do not inherently alter the climatic conditions of our planet, as the word anthropogenic perhaps suggests. Of course, certain groups of people are historically more implicated and more responsible for these rapacious and extractive practices tied to settler colonialism, as I tried to show here, to chattel slavery, which has its own vivid history here in New York, dating back to this exact period of Dutch settlement, to capitalism, and perhaps more recently to neoliberalism. In other words, who is the Anthropocene really for, and what histories must we recognize when envisioning this epoch? What Todd, who wrote these questions, tried to demonstrate is that indigenous peoples have long faced the end of their lifeways, including radical ecological and even climatic changes. So when discussing the Anthropocene and the impending fate of humanity, we must first recognize that not all of humanity is historically implicated. Climate change, as Potawatomi scholar Kyle White writes, is an intensification or an amplification of environmental change imposed on indigenous peoples by colonialism. And in order to understand these presents and these futures that we face, we must, of course, examine narratives of the past. So as I continue this research over the next few months, I will now be turning to these presents and these futures, and I should note that I utilize the plural forms of these words, past, presents, and futures, to stress the different lived experiences of peoples in this temporalities. So I will soon be looking now at the New York City Panel on Climate Change's assessment reports to sort of grasp the projections of changes in this area over the next century and further into geological time. My final task then will be to envision alternative ways of being and knowing. Perhaps only through recognizing these contested narratives, these counter-realities and alternative ontologies, can we learn to better respect the land on which we all stand and the human and non-human species of which we are all inherently entangled. Thank you.
Who has some questions for Ben? Please.
Hi, I'm Ben's brother. Have you seen the Atlantic article about challenging the whole idea of the Anthropocene as a geological epoch?
Yeah.
Can you comment on that?
I haven't seen
Tell-
the article
give us a little-
specifically. Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit more?
A geologist was questioning how, was kind of critiquing how human-centric the idea of the
Yeah.
Anthropocene is, and saying, well, to give a silly example, he said, it could be there was a highly civilized, period in the dinosaur age in which they had floating cars and stuff like that. We would have absolutely no evidence of that in geological time. So do you agree with the assessment of, who are we to, develop this idea of the Anthropocene, assuming that billions of years from now we're going to have a geological layer?
Exactly. We are sort of a blip in the geological time, and sort of to call this period the Anthropocene, naming it after ourselves, is sort of ironic. And there is definitely a lot of contestation, not only there, but just like everything about the Anthropocene is highly debated amongst social scientists, among just natural scientists. So yeah, it's a very contested theory and idea.
Thank you.
I have a question
Yeah.
too. What would be the ultimate document you would like to find so you can have a better historical overview of what really went on? Because the lenses we look through is modern interpretation of what the Lenape would have said, and one document which the Dutch wrote in 1626. So,
I think an ideal piece of history would be either an oral history written down or also just a written piece of history. But of course, the Lenape didn't write in English as we do, and they didn't even write on paper as we do. So it's sort of impossible to find these histories and these narratives dating back to that exact period, which is why I sort of utilized more contemporary histories and oral histories. But yeah, I think definitely if we had any sort of perspective from that time, it would definitely make this more concrete. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. After the presentations, you will be able to look at the choices that Ben made for his research here and ask more questions. Our second speaker this morning is Beth Sherman. She is a PhD candidate in English at the CUNY Graduate Center, and she has an MFA in creative writing and an MA in English from Queen's College, where she also teaches in the English department. Her work has appeared in various publications, including Dickens Studies Annual, James Joyce's Quarterly, the New York Times, and the Portland Review. And Beth also is a Pushcart nominee and a Best of the Net finalist, and has written 5 mystery novels. Her research interests include the relationship between the study of literature and the environment from an interdisciplinary point of view, and she's currently exploring the ways in which the institutional history of garden movement and landscape design affected Edith Wharton and her outlook on writing, and her writing. And she will give us this morning an opportunity to see a sneak preview in The Old Garden Magic, Edith Wharton's influences and inspirations.
Oh, that moved over here. Well, hi everyone. Thank you for coming out this morning. Before I get started, I wanted to thank the Mellon Foundation, the Humanities Institute, the CUNY Graduate Center, and everyone here at the Mertz Library who has assisted in my research over the summer. It's been a pleasure to be here. So, as Vanessa said, my title is The Old Garden Magic, Edith Wharton's Influences and Inspirations. So, as a PhD candidate in English at the CUNY Graduate Center, my research centers around eco-criticism, which is the relationship between the study of literature and the environment from an interdisciplinary standpoint. One of the writers I am particularly interested in is Edith Wharton. Wharton is best known for her portrait of New York society in the Gilded Age, including the sumptuous mansions and elegant ballrooms where Mrs. Astor's 400 dined and danced. She also was an avid gardener who believed in the power plants have to affect emotions. Early in her career, after she had created her first garden at the Mount in Lenox, Massachusetts, she claimed she was a better landscape designer than novelist. Gardens appear frequently in her novels and short stories, spaces where her characters go to escape and reflect, and where flowers often symbolize her heroine's various tendencies and traits. Yet this aspect of her writing, as well as her passion for gardening, has not fully been explored in previous biographies or in literary scholarship. Similarly, her book, Italian Villas and Their Gardens, has not received the attention lavished on much of her other work. In the introduction to Italian Villas and Their Gardens, Wharton writes, "The garden lover who longs to transfer something of the old garden magic to his own patch of ground at home asks himself, what can I bring away from here? And the more he studies and compares, the more inevitably will the answer be, not this or that amputated statue or broken bas-relief or fragmentary effect of any sort, but a sense of the informing spirit and understanding of the gardener's purpose and of the uses to which he meant his garden to be put." My research at the New York Botanical Garden this summer has focused on Wharton's own purpose, particularly why she gravitated to certain plants and flowers in her writing and her gardens, and what her gardening design influences were. At the Mount, her library contains 27 tomes on gardening. Among them are books with diametrically opposed views. For instance, she owned William Robinson's The Wild Garden and Reginald Blomfield's The Formal Gardens in England. For decades, there were heated debates in American and European European horticultural circles about which man was taking the quote-unquote right approach to landscape design. Robinson deplores the bedding system where showy exotic plants from subtropical lands are put in the soil until they're cut down by the first frosts. Instead, he advocates for hardy plants such as lilies, bluebells, foxgloves, clematis, and wildflowers that, quote, will thrive in our English climate. He suggests replacing iron fences with living fences of holly or other strong bushes, such as sweetbriar, in a rough, wild-looking hedge, and using grass drives instead of gravel walks, leaving the grass unmown as much as possible. Blomfield's rather snarky book rebuts Robinson's point of view sharply. He says, anyone who loves natural scenery will want the real thing. Mr. Robinson is engaged in a perpetual struggle to prove her, nature, an ass. Blomfield favors brick walls with their clean lines of demarcation, a series of courts that frame the house, bowling greens with fountains or statues in the middle, meticulously planned graveled walks, and pleaching, which is the practice dating from early Roman times of trimming small boughs and foliage into regular shapes. He hates the way Robinson lays out paths at random, keeping them so narrow that they look like threads, so there's barely room to walk abreast, and maintains that in achieving a natural look, Robinson and his cohort actually engage in a, quote, wholesale destruction of trees, alteration of ground, and building up of rocks to heighten the illusion to natural woods. According to his philosophy, the word garden itself means an enclosed space, a yard surrounded by walls as opposed to unenclosed fields and woods. The formal garden, he maintains, with its insistence on strong boundary lines, is strictly speaking the only garden possible. In her 1904 book, Italian Villas and Their Gardens, Wharton embraces Blomfield's love of 16th century formal garden designs. She praises the broad paths, the clipped ilex and laurel walks, the raised terraces, and the level sward of the bowling green that she noticed at gardens in Florence, Siena, and Rome. However, in her own French-inspired garden at the Mount, which you should all visit if you haven't already, she also incorporated shrubs and perennials in vivid bursts of color, including phlox, lilies, hydrangea, dianthus, delphinium, and dahlias, of which Robinson would surely approve. For Wharton, the choice is not purely a binary one. Her gardens in America and in France encompass both formal and wild features. In Hyères, in the south of France, for example, Wharton carved her Riviera garden out of a hillside with drifts of flowers on ascending terraces, and her rock garden was renowned for its collection of subtropical plants that were native to the area. Yet another influence for Wharton is Gertrude Jekyll, the leading exponent of cottage gardening in England, who is best known for her subtle and harmonious approach to color. Wharton was a great admirer of Jekyll's work, arranging the annuals and perennials in her flower garden at the Mount in exuberant, abundant drifts favored by the English designer. Recalling a visit to Jekyll's garden in her autobiography, A Backward Glance, she wrote, "On that long-desired day, I had 100 questions to ask, 1,000 things to learn." Wharton owned a copy of Jekyll's Lilies for English Gardens and made tick marks next to varieties she favored and considered planting, including the white Lilium japonicum, the pink Lilium cremeri, and the Lilium pardalinum, a spectacular 7-foot-high lily with deep orange flowers and purple spots in the throat, whose stems carry from 20 to 30 blossoms at the top on long stalks. At Pavillon Colombe, her garden outside of Paris, Wharton shows the flowers in a color scheme that shifted from orange to mauve to pink, following Jekyll's credo that planting should be designed to show a distinct scheme of color arrangement. Still another key influence for Wharton is Beatrix Jones Farran, Wharton's beloved niece, who designed the driveway and the kitchen garden at the Mount, as well as the rose garden at Pavillon Colombe, and who originally laid out the Peggy Rockefeller Rose Garden here at our garden. Farran felt that simple lines and quiet color are satisfying to the eye. In 1907, she wrote an article called "The Garden as a Picture" for Scribner's Magazine, saying no collection of flowers, no matter how beautiful, make a garden. masses of color and masses of greenery must be balanced, and to achieve perfect naturalistic harmony, this needed to be done on a very large scale. Ferran believed in working with native plants and the natural conditions of climate and topography. At her home in Reef Point, Maine, she used plants that were native to the rugged Maine seacoast, including azaleas and heathers, which thrived in the sea mists. At Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C., she added more oaks, beeches, elms, and maples to what was already there, creating a strong continuity in the planting of trees of the same species but various ages. One critic described Ferran's work as the English formal garden diffused by horticultural impressionism. Ferran and Wharton, who was only 10 years her senior, took several trips abroad together. In Italian villas and their gardens, Wharton states the importance of a garden well adapted to its surroundings, the Ferran Manifesto, and describes the close relationship between landscape and architecture, much the way Ferran insists that the courtyard at Dumbarton Oaks should be thought of as an unroofed room. Wharton also frequently used flowers and plants as symbols and signposts in her work. I am going to talk about two examples of that today. Many of you are probably already familiar with her novel, The House of Mirth, which recounts the life of Lily Bart, a young woman whose independence and refusal to settle leads to her tragic destiny. Scholars have noted that the word lily symbolizes purity and virginity because of its depiction in religious art, where it came to be associated with the Virgin, its white petals symbolizing her purity. But they are only looking at the white lily when making that assessment. Okay, I'm a little behind my slides here. I have discovered there are 100 species of lilies and hundreds, if not thousands, of hybrids. Flower colors range from white through all shades of pink to deep red, yellow, and orange. Several language of flower books published before and after 1905, when Wharton was writing House of Mirth, assign different traits to other species of lilies than the white. For instance, the yellow lily represents falsehood and gaiety, while the daylily is linked with coquetry. These are significant associations because Lily Bart is not just a pure virginal woman. She's a complicated character who loves opulent parties and flirts her way through the novel. While looking through a copy of Les Fleurs Animées, illustrated by G.G. Grandville in 1847, I found still other meanings associated with the lily, and this is one that is on the book over there that we can look at after the talk. And as an admitted Francophile, Wharton would surely have been familiar with Grandville's book. His depiction of the white lily, as you can see, shows a tall, statuesque woman in bridal attire, poised and unsmiling, looking quite regal and aloof, almost untouchable. Ironically, while Lily fields several offers of marriage, she never becomes a bride herself, which would improve her unsettled financial condition. In the illustration, there is a beetle in the left lower corner, gazing up at her like a loyal subject. And I thought this was a telling detail because the fictional Lily is adored and pursued by many single and married men in the novel. Grandville writes, "In the open air, the odor of the lily is delicious, but it is dangerous in confined apartments. Not only is it unpleasant in its effects upon the animal economy, it is sometimes sufficiently powerful to produce asphyxia." And this, I thought, was an intriguing quote in the context of Lily's personality, her storyline, and her ultimate fate, which is overdosing on a sleeping draught of chloral hydrate in what is either an accident or a suicide attempt. If you haven't read the book, I've just spoiled the ending for you. The apartment reference could connect to the opening scene of the novel, where Lily unwisely visits the Manhattan apartment of her unmarried friend, Lawrence Selden, unchaperoned. The ensuing gossip and scandal over this event plague her throughout the book. I am also interested in the way in which Wharton depicts flowers and plants in her first published short story, which not that many, even Wharton lovers, are familiar with, called Mrs. Manstey's View. The story, which appeared in 1891, is about an elderly widow who lives alone in a tenement building in Manhattan. Brick tenements tend to be fairly uniform on Manhattan's identical 25 by 100-foot lots and were about 5 stories high. They were so crowded in part because many immigrants took in boarders or lodgers to help cover the rent, and Mrs. Manstey is just such a lodger. Her one pleasure is looking out her window at the untended backyard below. Though her view is restricted, She can see the topmost boughs of an ailanthus below her window, and she knew how early each year the clump of dicentra strung its bending stalk with hearts of pink. Wharton writes that some of the yards were indeed but stony wastes, with grass in the cracks of the pavement, and no shade in spring save that afforded by the intermittent leafage of the clotheslines. However, Mrs. Manstey does manage to glimpse a magnolia opening its hard white flowers against the watery blue of April, as well as the lilac waves of wisteria and a horse chestnut, which persisted in growing in spite of the countless obstacles opposed to its welfare. I believe Wharton chose these particular plants and trees deliberately. They're fighters, they survive. The horse chestnut is a hardy tree that is widely cultivated in a range of temperate climatic conditions in both Europe and America. The tree can live for up to 300 years and tolerates city life well, which is why it is often planted along urban streets. I learned from the Plant Talk blog at the Garden's website that ailanthus, also known as the tree of heaven, is a particularly aggressive species because it's able to become established in many different habitats, grow rapidly, which gives it the ability to produce seeds in a short time, generate winged fruits, which enables it to be efficiently dispersed by the wind, and grow in contaminated soils. As a consequence of its ability to produce abundant seeds, it moves easily from one place to another, and once established, suckers allow it to produce additional stems. It's a very adaptable tree. It's also an invasive tree, which is perfect for the streets below New York City tenements. It thrives just about anywhere: poor soil, alleys, cracks in the pavement, and its root system is aggressive enough to damage sewers and building foundations. Dicentra, which I grow in my own garden, is an easy-care, hardy perennial for shady gardens that will flower for many years without dividing. The plant is also known as bleeding heart for its heart-shaped blossoms that dangle from slender, arching stems. This choice is significant because Wharton intimates throughout the story that Mrs. Manstey's heart is profoundly affected by her view. Without it, she is like a plant uprooted from the soil that will eventually die. Jacob Riis, author of How the Other Half Lives, describes 19th century tenement buildings as dark and poorly ventilated. He relates how outdoor space was increasingly co-opted by builders who erased traces of nature to erect more and more buildings. He writes, "In the old garden where the stolid Dutch burgher grew his tulips or early cabbages, a rear house was built, generally of wood, 2 stories high at first, and then another story was added and another. The garden gate no longer swings on its rusty hinges. The shell-paved walk had become an alley." In 1894, New York State established a tenement house committee, which found that over 70% of Manhattan's population of roughly 1.8 million people at that time lived in multifamily dwellings. There was terrific overcrowding, a high rate of disease, and a lack of accessible parks. For Mrs. Manstey, the natural world is more than something pretty to look at. It is what keeps her alive, and when her view is threatened by a landlord who is building an extension to the property, she undertakes one last heroic act. I won't spoil that by telling you what that is, but to save what she loves. The extension is possible because zoning restrictions to limit the height of buildings and to avoid the shutting off of light and air from public streets did not go into effect until 1916. Inside her apartment, Mrs. Manstey nurses an ivy and a succession of, quote, unwholesome-looking bulbs in a slightly projecting bow window. I looked through several gardening books published in the 19th century that indicated how popular container gardening was at that time. One of them, called Window Gardening, devoted especially to the culture of flowers and ornamental plants for indoor use and parlor decoration, quite a long title, published in 1872, explains that no home of taste is considered complete without its window garden. Ivy was an especially good choice for the window because it is both cheap, clean, needs little attention, grows rapidly, and is the most permanently attractive of all plants. As the book editors note, the ivy might be called the poor man's vine, for it will grow for almost anyone. It will live long in one pot without change of soil or position. It accommodates itself to all temperatures save that below freezing, and when in full growth, it adds more grace to the window than any plant yet used. The ivy seems to be the least sensitive to changes of light of any plant we have. Neither does it require much heat. Of Mrs. Manstey, Wharton writes, "Perhaps she was an artist. At all events, she was sensible of many changes of color, unnoticed by the average eye, and dear to her as the early green spring was the black lattice of branches against a cold sulfur sky at the close of a snowy day. Wharton, of course, is also an artist who used nature to reinforce character development, plot lines, and themes in virtually all of her novels and short stories. She believed that gardens should be architectural compositions just like houses, and she envisioned her gardens as a series of outdoor rooms in harmony with nature. In her memoirs, the garden became the metaphor for her life of the imagination, the place where she conceived her stories and characters. My project attempts to understand Wharton's many and varied influences when it comes to garden design, to examine how and why she used flora in her writing, and to shine a fresh light on this underrepresented area of her work. What I have discussed here today is only a small part of what I have discovered at the New York Botanical Garden this summer and what I intend to keep exploring in the months to come. Thank you.
Are there any questions for us? No questions? I have a question.
Okay.
I love that, and it's very surprising expression that she says she sees herself almost as a better gardener than a
Yes.
novelist. Because today we don't know much about her gardening as such. Could you say a little bit more about what she did at the Mount, and can we still recognize some of her gardening approach there actually today?
I believe so. She also made that reference specifically to the House of Mirth, which is extraordinary given how popular the House of Mirth was, that you would be a better gardener than the writer of the House of Mirth. So she wasn't really saying that abstractly. But at the Mount, yes, as I showed in that Mount picture, there are elements of that 16th century garden that Bloomfield espoused, and that she also admired through her travels in Italy. But then there was also the Robinson influence of the wild influence and the perennials, and that everything didn't have to be, bedded out.
And today you will still find that.
Yes, today you will
kept
still
up like
you will
that.
still find it. I mean, that book about the lilies that's in her garden at the Mount. There, when she checked off which lilies she liked, the people at the Mount tried to plant those lilies, to make it look like what she had designed. But I think they tried to do that to the best of their ability. But it's hard to reconstruct.
Yeah.
And I think the same goes for the south of France as well. It's hard to reconstruct her gardens, in the south of France exactly as they were. So.
Thank you very much. Are there further questions? No, then we will have another applause for our two speakers, and please enjoy